Hello, I'm Mike Stockwell. You might be known to me if you're a Stockwell yourself, or at least related to one of them. I'm here in the square at Petersfield, where in 1906 some remarkable events unfolded in the career of Police Constable Charles Stockwell, my great-grandfather. Charles had joined Hampshire Police in 1902, and in the photo here is pictured front row, second from the left. The 17th of August 1906 was destined to be a routine day here in Petersfield, a fairly sleepy market town. The events of the 17th of August 1906 would be remembered by Charles throughout his career. On his retirement in 1933, the Hampshire Chronicle reminded him of the story. His photo upon retirement is shown here. Charles arrested a naval stoker from HMS Nelson who had gone AWOL from a firing range in Portsmouth and had walked 15 miles to Petersfield with a high-velocity rifle firing at people. This is 35 Pens Road. In 1906, this was Charles's home. He was stationed at Petersfield Police Station, the other side of town, and he lived here with his older wife Helen, aged 34, and his two young sons, Lewis, aged 4, Cedric, aged 2, and young baby daughter Nora, aged 1. According to weather records, 17th of August 1906 was yet another sunny, fine day in the south of England. Now, being stationed on the opposite side of town, Charles was on duty and he dropped in here for a cuppa. Helen, his wife, was always pleased to see him. Now, at 4:45 p.m, there was an urgent knock at the door. Horace Fielder, the manager at the corn store down the road here, had rushed to tell Charles that a man in naval uniform had walked through the town firing at people, and that he was now at the end of the road, firing on occasions at a crowd that had gathered by the railway crossing. Charles immediately sprang into action, dashed out of the door and ran down to the end of Pens Road, where I'm standing. A large crowd had gathered outside the gates to the level crossing behind where I'm standing. They were stood there watching Burbage, the gunman, make his way down the road towards Winchester. They ducked and scattered whenever Burbage turned round and pointed his rifle at them. Little did Charles know at this moment that Burbage, the gunman, had actually walked 15 miles from Portsmouth, had gone through the town centre, firing his rifle at buildings and people, and had now crossed the level crossing. Charles first spotted Burbage, a man in naval uniform with a bandolier of bullets over his shoulder, outside the Volunteer Arms pub, about 100 yards from where I'm standing. Charles was also oblivious to the fact that a lady called Margaret Treble lay bleeding with a wound to her thigh caused by a shot from Burbage's rifle. She was laid there outside the railway hotel, now demolished, which used to be behind the station. Worse still, Margaret's 2-year-old daughter Doris and sister-in-law Amelia had witnessed the whole event. They'd been here in town on a fine summer's afternoon, drinking tea, shopping, and were about to be taken home by Margaret's brother-in-law in a pony and trap, a bit like the one shown in the photo. The road out of town behind me has changed greatly over the last 118 years. We've reached as far as the Rushes, the row of houses just behind me, and that was effectively the border between built-up Petersfield and countryside. Burbage came past here, followed by Charles Stockwell. Charles kept a distance of about 100 yards and was joined after a time by his colleague PC George Pullman. They themselves were followed by a crowd who ducked into the hedges whenever Burbage turned round and pointed his rifle at them. Sometimes Burbage fired. An inquest was held on the Saturday, the day after the shooting. Charles told the inquest I saw Burbage, a man in naval uniform, who was carrying a rifle, and he had the pose of a man who was on the lookout for something to shoot when it came into his sight. He then recounted that he and PC Pullman had a bullet fly past them. Well, there we have it. My great-grandfather Charles Stockwell is the only Stockwell I know who's had a Lee Metford Mark II military rifle fired at them. Charles continued to the inquest. If only I can get in front of him. Perhaps I can head him off by diving through the hedge and running through the meadow, which may well have been in front of me where I'm standing now. Unfortunately, that plan backfired. Charles had to come back through the hedge. He couldn't cut him off, and he rejoined PC Pullman on the road out towards Winchester, following Burbage the gunman. I'm now standing outside the Seven Stars public house, which existed in 1906. Gunman Burbage reached as far as the end of the drive here, adjoining the road towards Winchester. Now, police constables in those days were unarmed, as indeed they are now. However, there was then a dramatic intervention. 2 shots rang out from the meadow to my right. They were fired by a shotgun, fired by a man called Douglas Goldsmith, an auctioneer from Petersfield, who'd come out with his gun. The shots were enough to down Burbage. Charles rushed forward. Now, Burbage had his rifle with his bayonet fixed, pointed at Charles. Charles managed to knock the rifle out of his hands, subdued him, arrested and handcuffed him. Credit goes to PC George Pullman, who assisted in the arrest. After a while, a man named Edward Fenn volunteered his horse and cart to transport the arrested criminal back to town. I'm now standing outside the old police station in Petersfield. Burbage was transported back here in the cart. According to the Hampshire Chronicle, Charles Stockwell was sat in the front of the cart, cradling the Lee Metford rifle, bayonet still fixed in his arms. George Pullman, his colleague, was guarding Burbage in the back. Burbage was put in the cells, which are preserved in this very building behind me. As Burbage was sat in his cell, the tragedy of the day's events unfolded. Margaret Treble died from blood loss from the wounds she sustained. At 6:30 p.m, less than 2 hours since the original knock at the door, Charles had arrested a man who, if charged and convicted of murder, would now be facing a mandatory sentence of death by hanging. Charles returned home later that evening, and what events had unfolded in the hours since the original knock at the door. We can imagine what might have been going through the mind of this young police constable. In 1901, he'd left a secure job on Great Western Railways in Reading. Now, he'd left the job to get married, and his wife Helen, according to his grandson David, had insisted that she would only marry him if he promised to join the police. Helen saw the police as a secure job. She'd learnt that as a child because her father, David Thomas, was a police sergeant in Glamorgan. But now look at the scrape that Charles had got into. How was his wife Helen going to respond to knowing that he'd been fired on by a military rifle? What if one of the bullets had struck Charles? As for his 3 children, how close had they become to becoming fatherless on that day? Now, Charles was called as a witness at the trial of Joseph Burbage. On Saturday the 24th of November 1906, the trial took place here behind me in the Great Hall at Winchester Castle, a building steeped in history. Unknown to Burbage, as he was led into the Great Hall, 303 years earlier, Sir Walter Raleigh had been tried here for treason. Importantly, since the commission of the crime, Burbage's alias had been uncovered. He was actually a Herbert Mitchell from Sydenham in London, who coincidentally grew up in North Hampshire. Mitchell had used an alias when he joined the Navy for a second time. He'd previously been dismissed from the service for misconduct, and nobody spotted that on his application, his reapplication, he was using a different name. Now, Charles had been called as a witness for the prosecution, and the newspaper report of the trial records that he was in the witness box for only a short time. So what befell Herbert Mitchell? Was he destined for the hangman's noose on the scaffold at Winchester Prison? Well, as we will learn, he managed to escape that fate. Now, the jury were invited by the judge, Mr. Justice Kennedy, to agree on a special verdict of not guilty of murder by reason of insanity. Medical evidence was presented by Herbert's lawyer, a Mr. Broderick, that Mitchell had been in a state of delusion caused by epileptic mania at the time of the commission of the crime on the 17th of August. According to legal rules, called the Macnaghten Rules, established 6 years earlier, Mitchell could be found not guilty by reason of insanity and hence not responsible for his actions on the day. Now, there's no doubt that the husband of the victim, Margaret Treble, may have thought this verdict to be unjust. Nevertheless, Mitchell had been found not guilty by reason of insanity according to the legal rules, and hence at the time of the act, not in his right mind or responsible for his actions. Mitchell was ordered to be detained at Broadmoor, then called an asylum for the criminally insane. He subsequently died there in his 30s, a young age, from pneumonia. The events of the 17th of August 1906 would be remembered by Charles right up to his retirement in 1933. The Hampshire Chronicle covered his retirement, and Charles is shown here in the photograph. Charles continued as a constable in Petersfield, even taking part in the annual cricket match between the tradesmen and the police in 1908. Later that year, he was posted to a village called Sparsholt near Winchester and became village policeman right up to his retirement. The notorious events of 17th of August 1906 had become part of Petersfield's history. For Charles, it was the most significant event in his police career and a story to be handed down to future generations. One thing is for sure, the people of this town have known nothing like it since, in the 118 years that have gone since those terrible events.